We hunted them from the sky. One by one, they disappeared beneath the waves. The Japanese convoy stretched below us like a broken necklace scattered across the emerald waters of the Visayas, each ship a desperate bead trying to escape the inevitable. My Hellcat's engine roared as I banked hard to starboard, the G-forces pressing me deep into my seat. Through my gun sight, I could see the enemy destroyer attempting to zigzag away from our attack, its wake cutting white scars across the Pacific. But there was nowhere to run. Not today. Not in these waters that had become America's hunting ground. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jack Morrison, and I flew scout missions for the United States Navy during the final push to retake the Philippines in late 1944. What I witnessed during those months changed me forever, not just as a pilot, but as a man who understood the true cost of victory. The Japanese had held these islands for nearly 3 years, turning them into fortresses and supply bases for their crumbling empire. But MacArthur was coming back, just as he had promised, and we were his eyes in the sky. The morning of October 12, 1944 began like so many others at our forward base on Hollandia. The tropical sun was already climbing high by 0600 hours, and the humid air clung to our flight suits like a second skin. I had been flying combat missions for 18 months, ever since the Marshall Islands campaign, and I could feel the weight of every sortie in my bones. But this day would be different. This day, we would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese shipping that would starve their garrisons throughout the Philippines. Morrison, "You're leading Blue Flight today," Commander Hayes called out as I grabbed my flight helmet from the ready room. "Intelligence reports a major convoy moving through the Visayas. Looks like they're trying to reinforce Manila before we can cut them off completely." I nodded, checking my watch. "How many ships are we talking about, sir?" "At least 12 confirmed, possibly more. Mix of destroyers, cruisers, and transports. They're heavily loaded, probably carrying everything from ammunition to rice." Hayes paused, his weathered face serious. "Jack, this could be one of the biggest hunting opportunities we've had. Don't let them slip away." The briefing room was packed with pilots from our squadron, the VF-15 Fighting Aces. We had been flying together for over a year, and I knew each man's capabilities as well as my own. Lieutenant Bobby Chen, my wingman, sat in the front row, already plotting our approach vectors on his kneeboard. Behind him, Ensign Mike O'Sullivan was checking his ammunition count for the 3rd time, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through 14 combat missions. The intelligence officer, a thin lieutenant named Patterson, stood before a large map of the central Philippines. Red pins marked suspected enemy positions, while blue arrows showed our planned attack routes. "Gentlemen, this convoy represents one of the last major attempts by the Japanese to resupply their forces in the Philippines. They're moving at night and hiding in small harbors during the day, but our reconnaissance flights have tracked them through the Visayas." He pointed to a cluster of islands between Leyte and Mindanao. "Latest reports put them here, in the strait between Bohol and Camiguin. They're using the narrow channels to avoid our submarines, but that also makes them perfect targets for air attack. The water is deep enough for shipping, but shallow enough that anything we sink will create a permanent obstacle." I studied the map carefully. The Visayas were a maze of islands, channels, and reefs, perfect for hiding but also perfect for trapping. If we could catch the convoy in one of those narrow straits, they would have limited room to maneuver. "What about fighter cover?" I asked. "Minimal," Patterson replied. "The Japanese are conserving their remaining aircraft for the main battle. You may encounter some float planes, but nothing like the opposition we faced at Truk or Rabaul." 30 minutes later, I was strapped into the cockpit of my F6F Hellcat, running through the pre-flight checklist. The big Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine turned over with a satisfying roar, 18 cylinders of American engineering ready to carry me into battle. My aircraft, nicknamed Pacific Prowler, had been with me through campaigns across the Central Pacific. Together, we had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft and sunk or damaged dozens of enemy vessels. The takeoff was smooth, despite the crosswind that always seemed to plague our forward airstrips. Blue Flight consisted of 4 Hellcats, each loaded with 6 .50 caliber machine guns and additional ammunition for extended combat. We climbed steadily to 15,000 feet, where the air was cooler and our engines could run more efficiently. As we headed northwest toward the Visayas, I could see the vast expanse of the Pacific stretching endlessly in all directions. Below us, dozens of islands dotted the blue waters like emeralds scattered by a giant's hand. Somewhere among those islands, a Japanese convoy was racing against time, trying to reach Manila Bay before American forces could intercept them. "Blue Leader, this is Blue 2. Bobby Chen's voice crackled through my headset. "I'm picking up radio chatter on the Japanese frequency. Sounds like they're coordinating with shore batteries." I keyed my microphone. "Copy that, Blue 2. Stay sharp, everyone. If they're talking to shore batteries, it means they're close to land and expecting trouble." The flight continued in relative silence for another 40 minutes. The monotonous drone of our engines was hypnotic, but I forced myself to stay alert. In the Pacific, complacency killed more pilots than enemy fire. I constantly scanned the sky for aircraft and the water for ships, knowing that the first to spot the enemy usually held the advantage. At 0930 hours, Ensign O'Sullivan's excited voice broke the radio silence. "Blue Leader, Blue 4. I have multiple contacts bearing 270 approximately 8 miles. Looks like our convoy." I banked left and peered through my cockpit glass. At first, I saw nothing but the typical pattern of islands and channels. Then, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the ships began to materialize. They were strung out in a long line, threading their way through a narrow strait between two mountainous islands. Even from our altitude, I could see the distinctive wakes of at least 15 vessels. "Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader. I count at least 15 ships in convoy formation. Looks like they're trying to make the open water beyond the strait." I paused, studying the tactical situation. "Blue 2 and Blue 3, take the leading elements. Blue 4, you're with me on the trailing ships. We'll work from both ends and trap them in the middle." The attack began with a steep diving approach from the southeast, using the morning sun to mask our approach. The Hellcat was a remarkable aircraft for this type of attack, fast enough to close quickly, stable enough for accurate gunnery, and tough enough to absorb punishment from return fire. As we dove toward the convoy, I could see the ships more clearly. The leading vessels were two destroyers, their sleek hulls cutting through the water at high speed. Behind them came a light cruiser, followed by a string of cargo ships and transports. At 8,000 feet, I pulled out of the dive and began my attack run on the trailing destroyer. The ship was desperately trying to increase speed, black smoke pouring from its stacks as the engine room crew pushed their machinery to the limit. But there was nowhere to go. The strait was too narrow for effective evasive maneuvers. I lined up the destroyer in my gun sight and squeezed the trigger. 6 streams of .50 caliber bullets tore across the water and raked the ship's superstructure. I could see sparks flying as the armor-piercing rounds struck metal, and small explosions bloomed along the destroyer's deck. The ship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the air with angry black puffs of flak. But their aim was poor, and I flew through their barrage unscathed. "Blue Leader, good hits on the tin can," Bobby Chen called out. "I'm going after the cruiser." I pulled up and banked around for another pass, watching as Chen's Hellcat dove on the Japanese cruiser. The larger ship was putting up a fierce anti-aircraft barrage, but Bobby pressed his attack with a cool precision that had made him one of our squadron's top pilots. His bullets stitched across the cruiser's bridge, and I saw several figures fall from the ship's superstructure. Meanwhile, Blue 3 and Blue 4 were working over the cargo ships at the front of the convoy. These vessels were slower and less heavily armed, but they were also the most valuable targets. Each transport could carry hundreds of tons of supplies desperately needed by Japanese forces in the Philippines. Sinking them would have a direct impact on the enemy's ability to continue fighting. I lined up for my second pass on the destroyer, this time approaching from directly ahead. The ship was now burning in several places, but its guns were still firing. As I closed to within 500 yards, I could see Japanese sailors running across the deck, some trying to fight the fires while others manned the anti-aircraft weapons. I squeezed the trigger again, and this time my bullets found something vital. A massive explosion erupted amidships, sending a column of smoke and flame hundreds of feet into the air. "Blue Leader, that destroyer is finished." O'Sullivan's voice was excited. She's listing heavily to port and taking on water. I pulled up and circled back to assess the damage. The destroyer was indeed dying, its hull tilted at a dangerous angle as seawater poured through holes torn in its side. Japanese sailors were jumping overboard, preferring to take their chances in the water rather than go down with their ship. Within minutes, the destroyer rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only an oil slick and floating debris to mark its passing. But there was no time to celebrate. The convoy was still trying to escape, and every minute of delay meant more enemy ships might reach the relative safety of Manila Bay. I turned my attention to the cargo ships, which were now scattered across the strait in desperate attempts to avoid our attacks. Blue 2, I'm seeing a large transport trying to hide behind that island, I called out. Can you get a shot at her? Roger, Blue Leader. I see her. She's a big one. Looks like a converted passenger liner. The transport was indeed impressive, probably over 10,000 tons and capable of carrying an entire regiment of Japanese troops. She was trying to use a small island as cover, but her size made concealment impossible. Chen approached from the north, using the island to mask his approach until the last moment. When he emerged from behind the rocky outcrop, the transport was caught completely off guard. Chen's first pass raked the ship's superstructure and started several fires. His second pass targeted the waterline, and I could see his bullets punching holes in the ship's hull. Water began pouring in, and the transport's list became more pronounced with each passing minute. She's taking on water fast, Chen reported. I think we got her engine room. The transport's death throes were agonizing to watch. The ship settled lower and lower in the water, her decks awash as the crew struggled to launch lifeboats. Finally, with a rumbling groan that was audible even over our engine noise, the transport broke apart and sank. The water was filled with debris and survivors, their hopes of reinforcing the Philippines now literally sinking beneath the waves. By 1100 hours, the strait had become a graveyard of Japanese shipping. Of the 15 ships we had initially identified, 8 were already on the bottom and 3 more were burning wrecks that would never reach port. The surviving vessels had scattered in different directions, some trying to reach the open ocean while others sought shelter in small harbors among the islands. Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader. We're running low on ammunition and fuel. Let's head for home and let the next wave finish the job. The flight back to Hollandia was strangely quiet. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, processing what we had accomplished and what it meant for the war effort. We had participated in the destruction of a major Japanese convoy, dealing a significant blow to the enemy's ability to supply their forces in the Philippines. But we had also watched hundreds of men die, and that knowledge weighed heavily on our minds. As we approached our base, I could see other squadrons preparing for launch. The war machine was operating at full capacity, with fresh aircraft and pilots ready to continue the hunt for remaining Japanese ships. The radio chatter was full of reports from other sectors, more convoys spotted, more attacks launched, more enemy vessels sent to the bottom. After landing and debriefing, I learned that our attack had been part of a coordinated effort across the entire Visayas region. Navy squadrons from multiple carriers had simultaneously struck Japanese shipping in dozens of locations, creating a devastating 1-2 punch that the enemy could not counter. The preliminary reports were staggering. Over 30 ships sunk or damaged in a single day, with minimal American losses. But the campaign was far from over. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were still attempting to move supplies through the Philippines, using smaller vessels and more circuitous routes. For the next several weeks, we would continue our hunting missions, methodically tracking down and destroying every enemy ship we could find. 3 days later, I was back in the cockpit for another convoy raid, this time targeting Japanese shipping in Manila Bay itself. The enemy was becoming desperate, using fishing boats and small coastal vessels to move supplies under cover of darkness. Our job was to find these vessels and sink them before they could reach their destinations. Manila Bay was a different kind of hunting ground than the open waters of the Visayas. The bay was large and shallow, with numerous small islands and sandbars that could hide small vessels. The Japanese had also established anti-aircraft batteries around the bay's perimeter, making low-level attacks more dangerous. But the potential rewards were enormous. Manila Bay was the primary supply hub for all Japanese forces in the central Philippines. We approached the bay from the southeast, flying at 20,000 feet to avoid the anti-aircraft batteries. Through my binoculars, I could see dozens of small vessels scattered across the bay's surface. Most were fishing boats and sampans, but intelligence had warned us that the Japanese were using these innocent-looking craft to transport ammunition and supplies. Blue Leader, this is Blue 2. I'm seeing a lot of small craft down there, but I can't tell which ones are legitimate fishing boats and which ones are enemy supply vessels. It was a dilemma that had plagued us throughout the campaign. The Japanese were masters of camouflage and deception, often using civilian vessels to transport military supplies. American policy was clear. We were to avoid attacking obviously civilian targets, but any vessel that appeared to be supporting the enemy war effort was fair game. Look for the telltale signs, I radioed back. Military vessels will be traveling in formation, moving too fast for fishing or carrying cargo that doesn't look like fish. As we circled the bay, I spotted a group of 6 vessels moving in a tight formation along the eastern shore. They were too organized to be fishing boats, and their course was taking them directly toward the main Japanese naval base at Cavite. I made my decision. Blue Flight. I have 6 contacts moving in formation along the east shore. They're heading for Cavite. I'm going down to take a closer look. I pushed the stick forward and began a steep descent toward the suspicious vessels. As I got closer, I could see that my suspicions were correct. The boats were low in the water, obviously heavily loaded, and armed guards were visible on their decks. These were definitely military supply vessels disguised as fishing boats. My first attack run scattered the formation as the boats tried to evade. The lead vessel was a converted fishing boat about 60 feet long, its hold probably packed with ammunition or rice. I lined up for an attack from the stern, where the boat's armor would be thinnest. My bullets stitched across the water and into the boat's hull, and I was rewarded with a spectacular secondary explosion that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. Ammunition boat, I called out. That one was carrying ordnance. The explosion had an immediate effect on the other boats, which began scattering in all directions. But there was nowhere to hide in the shallow bay, and my squadron mates were already lining up their own attack runs. Within minutes, 4 of the 6 boats were sinking or burning, their precious cargo lost to the bay's muddy bottom. The surviving boats had reached the shallows near Cavite, where our aircraft couldn't follow without risking damage from anti-aircraft fire. But it didn't matter. We had destroyed 2/3 of the convoy, and the supplies that might have kept Japanese forces fighting for another week were now fish food. Over the next month, we flew similar missions almost daily, gradually strangling the Japanese supply lines throughout the Philippines. The enemy was fighting back with increasing desperation, using everything from submarines to aircraft to protect their remaining shipping. But American air power was simply too overwhelming. For every one of our aircraft shot down, we were destroying 10 or more enemy vessels. The statistics were staggering. By the end of November 1944, American forces had sunk or severely damaged over 75 Japanese ships in Philippine waters. The enemy's ability to reinforce and resupply their garrisons had been virtually eliminated. Japanese soldiers on isolated islands were reduced to eating grass and roots, while their ammunition supplies dwindled to nothing. But the human cost was also mounting. Several of my squadron mates had been shot down during these operations, and while some were rescued, others were never seen again. The Japanese were showing no mercy to captured American pilots, and we all knew that being shot down over enemy territory was likely a death sentence. I was reminded of this harsh reality during a mission in early December, when we were hunting for a Japanese submarine that had been attacking American supply convoys near Mindanao. The submarine had been spotted on the surface, apparently trying to charge its batteries in broad daylight, a sign of how desperate the enemy had become. We found the submarine in a small bay on the southern coast of Mindanao, its conning tower clearly visible above the water. The vessel was probably a large fleet submarine, capable of carrying supplies as well as torpedoes. If we could sink it, we would eliminate both a threat to our shipping and a source of supply for Japanese forces in the area. The attack was textbook perfect. We approached from multiple directions, making it impossible for the submarine to dive before we could reach it. My first pass raked the conning tower with machine gun fire, killing or wounding the lookouts and preventing the submarine from submerging. Follow-up attacks by my wingmen punched holes in the submarine's hull, and within minutes the vessel was settling by the stern. But as the submarine was sinking, I saw something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Japanese sailors were jumping from the conning tower into the water, but instead of trying to swim to safety, they were swimming toward the sinking submarine. They were choosing to die with their ship rather than be captured by American forces. My God, O'Sullivan's voice was barely audible over the radio. They're swimming toward the sub. They're trying to go down with it. I watched in horrified fascination as the submarine's bow rose high in the air, then plunged beneath the waves. The sailors who had chosen to die with their ship disappeared beneath the surface, their sacrifice as complete as it was futile. Only a few oil bubbles and scattered debris marked the spot where a Japanese submarine and its crew had ceased to exist. The incident crystallized something that had been growing in my mind throughout the campaign. We were not just fighting ships and aircraft. We were fighting men who were willing to die rather than surrender. The Japanese military code of Bushido demanded death before dishonor, and we were seeing the practical application of that philosophy every day. It made our victories more complete, but it also made them more costly in human terms. As the campaign continued into 1945, the scope of our operations expanded beyond simple convoy raids. We were now hunting individual ships, small craft, and even barges that might be carrying supplies to Japanese forces. The enemy was using increasingly desperate measures to move supplies, including human porters carrying supplies overland and small boats that moved only at night. One particularly memorable mission involved tracking a Japanese supply barge that waystreamed to reach an isolated garrison on a small island near Palawan. The barge was only about 30 feet long, hardly worth the attention of a fighter squadron, but intelligence had indicated that it was carrying radio equipment desperately needed by Japanese forces in the area. We found the barge at dawn, trying to hide in the mangroves along the island's coast. The vessel was so small that it took all my skill as a pilot to hit it with machine gun fire. But when my bullets found their mark, the barge exploded with surprising violence, indicating that it had been carrying more than just radio equipment. That little barge was packed with explosives, I reported back to base, probably enough to supply a battalion for months. These small victories were adding up to a major strategic achievement. By early 1945, Japanese forces throughout the Philippines were effectively cut off from resupply. Their ammunition was running low, their food supplies were exhausted, and their communication with higher headquarters was sporadic at best. The systematic destruction of their shipping had achieved what might have taken months of ground combat to accomplish. But the war was far from over. Even as we celebrated our victories in the Philippines, intelligence reports were coming in about Japanese preparations for the defense of their home islands. The enemy was conserving aircraft, ships, and men for a final, desperate battle that would make our Philippines campaign look like a training exercise. I was rotating back to the United States in March 1945, after 18 months of continuous combat operations. My replacement was a young ensign fresh from flight school, eager to prove himself in combat. As I briefed him on the tactical situation in the Philippines, I tried to convey some of the lessons that I had learned during the campaign. The Japanese are finished in the Philippines, I told him, but don't underestimate them. They'll fight to the death, and they'll take as many of us with them as they can. Every mission is dangerous. Every enemy contact is potentially lethal. Stay alert, trust your training, and remember that your job is to sink ships, not to be a hero. The young ensign nodded seriously, but I could see the excitement in his eyes. He was looking forward to combat, just as I had been 2 years earlier. I hoped he would be luckier than some of my squadron mates who had paid the ultimate price for their service. As my transport aircraft lifted off from Hollandia for the long flight back to California, I looked down at the islands where I had spent so many months hunting Japanese shipping. The waters that had once been filled with enemy convoys were now controlled by American forces. The Philippines were being systematically liberated, and the Japanese Empire was being strangled by the loss of its shipping. But the cost had been enormous. Hundreds of American aircraft had been lost, and thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers had died in the waters of the Philippines. The ships we had sent to the bottom represented not just military hardware, but the hopes and dreams of a nation that had chosen war over peace. During my final mission briefing, Commander Hayes had shown us a map of the Pacific covered with red pins marking the locations of sunken Japanese ships. The pins were scattered from the Solomons to the Philippines, each one representing a vessel that would never again threaten American forces or supply Japanese garrisons. "Gentlemen," Hayes had said, "you have participated in one of the most successful naval campaigns in history. The Japanese merchant marine has been virtually eliminated, and their naval forces have been reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The war is far from over, but the enemy's ability to move supplies and reinforcements has been crippled." The statistics were indeed impressive. During the Philippines campaign alone, American forces had sunk or damaged over 75 Japanese ships, ranging from battleships to small coastal vessels. The enemy's shipping losses were so severe that they were reduced to using submarines as supply vessels, a desperate measure that indicated how completely their surface fleet had been destroyed. But as I sat in the transport aircraft, watching the Pacific Islands disappear beneath the clouds, I couldn't shake the memory of those Japanese sailors swimming toward their sinking submarine. They had chosen death over surrender, honor over survival. Their sacrifice had been complete and, from a military standpoint, pointless. But it had also been genuine, and I found myself respecting their courage even as I mourned their waste. The war would continue for several more months, ending only after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But for all practical purposes, the Japanese Empire had been defeated in the waters of the Pacific, where American submarines and aircraft had systematically destroyed the shipping that was the lifeblood of their war effort. I never returned to the Pacific as a combat pilot. My war ended in the Philippines, where I had learned that victory comes at a price that cannot be measured in ships sunk or aircraft destroyed. The cost is paid in human lives, in the dreams and hopes of young men who chose to serve their country in its hour of need. Some of those men returned home to build families and careers. Others remained forever beneath the waves, their sacrifice marked only by the memories of those who served beside them. The hunt for Japanese shipping in the Philippines was one of the most successful naval campaigns in history, but it was also one of the most brutal. We had hunted them from the sky, and one by one, they had disappeared beneath the waves. In the end, we had achieved our objective, the complete destruction of enemy shipping in Philippine waters. But the memory of those sinking ships, and the men who died aboard them, would remain with all of us for the rest of our lives. As I write these words more than 40 years after the war ended, I can still hear the sound of aircraft engineers over the Pacific, and I can still see the oil slicks marking the graves of Japanese ships. The war made heroes of some of us and casualties of others, but it changed all of us. We had been witness to the power of American industrial might and the courage of American fighting men. We had also seen the terrible cost of war, paid in blood and treasure by both sides. The Philippines campaign proved that American forces could adapt to any challenge and overcome any obstacle. We had taken the war to the enemy's doorstep and destroyed his ability to fight. But we had also learned that Victorian war is never without cost, and that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The ships we sank in Philippine waters were more than just military targets. They were symbols of an empire that had chosen war over peace, conquest over cooperation. Their destruction marked the beginning of the end for Japanese militarism, but it also marked the end of innocence for a generation of young Americans who had been forced to become warriors in defense of their country. The Pacific is quiet now, its waters no longer filled with the sound of aircraft engines and the smoke of burning ships. But beneath those peaceful waves lie the remains of more than 75 Japanese vessels, each one a testament to the courage and skill of the American pilots and sailors who fought to free the Philippines. Their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of all who served in the Pacific, must never be forgotten. For in remembering their service, we honor not just their memory, but the principles of freedom and democracy for which they fought and died.